Okay, this is chapters 27 and 28. Chapter 27, Hatching a Plan. Marie's plan was for me to go with Pilson to find the bodies. Pilson agreed to it because what choice did he have? It took only a few hours for him to assemble a team of local police officers and even federal agents to aid in the recovery of the bodies of Marie's mother and stepfather. I would be with them all the way. I would show them the route to take, and not even I would know exactly where we are going. Marie wanted to be sure they couldn't shake it out of me and go ahead on their own. She gave us the name of the town, and when we got there, I would phone her at the jail for the final location. We were to leave that afternoon. I had only to go home and pack a bag and get permission from my mother. Pot roast with carrots, my mother said when I walked through the door. She often did that, and that's the evening meal in lieu of actual greeting. I didn't expect you home so early. When I didn't say anything and hovered near the door, she turned and asked, "What is it? What's the matter?" "I can't stay for dinner," I said. "They need me to go to Nebraska." "Nebraska for what?" "Marie's going to tell us where the bodies are buried." She blinked. "What's your father say?" "He says I need to check with you." "Then no, of course not. It's too far. And on a school night?" "Mom." "And it isn't all right. It's morbid. You're not even 18 yet." "But..." "I said no, Michael. Now set the table and call your sister. There's Jell-O for dessert." I pursed my lips, but I called Dawn and we sat down to eat, even though it was more than an hour early and the roast was still tough. It was an awkward meal. Cuts of ham slapped down on my plate and sloshed with gravy, extra carrots because she knew I wasn't fond of them. Dawn giving me wide eyes and mouthing, "What did you do?" And I didn't get any Jell-O. I figured I would take the matter up again while we did the dishes, after she'd had more time to think it over. But as luck would have it, I didn't need to, because before we cleared the table, my dad came home with Pilson. When they came in, I stood up hopefully and was ordered upstairs, but I heard everything they said. "Absolutely not," my mother said. "It's not right to take a boy his age. Dead bodies after a killer?" She kept on like that for a long time, even speaking over my dad, so I crept back downstairs. "I have to go. Marie won't have it any other way." "I don't see why she has to get her way. It seems like she's always getting her way." "She's sitting in a jail cell," I said, "and this isn't just a body, it's her mother." My mom made a sad, frustrated sound. In the end, both Pilson and my dad had to swear that I would be in no danger and wouldn't be there for the actual discovery. They were relying on body counts as it happened, but they didn't need to know that at the time. Back at the jail, a caravan was waiting to take us to Nebraska and the city of North Platte. For reasons of jurisdiction, it was decided that my father would stay behind so I would be on my own. "Can I talk to Marie before we go?" I asked. "No time," Pilson said. "You can speak to her on the phone when we get there." He didn't want us cooking up any more schemes. Despite having access to all of our recordings, he'd become paranoid. We rode together in the same car all the way to Nebraska, and he stopped to eat supper on the way. But there were no more milkshakes and easy smiles. Pilson scrutinized my every movement like he was trying to crack a code. We stayed at a motel near North Platte off the interstate. The kid with a detached lobby where an old woman parsed out room keys from a wooden pegboard and offered you a warm-up from an hours-old pot of coffee. Our cars filled up the otherwise empty parking lot, but the woman who ran the place didn't snoop as if she saw a troop of investigators and federal agents pass through every month. When I asked her about it, she squinted at me. "Government workers, they're clean and their money's always good. Some of them even make the beds up before they check out, tight enough to bounce a quarter off." "Yeah," I said, every one of them is tight enough to bounce a quarter off." She chuckled. "I won't ask," she said, "but I imagine this is something to do with those murders last summer. I can't guess what you're doing caught up in it." "I'm Michael Jensen," I said, and shook her hand. I could tell she recognized my name. "I'm taking Marie Hale's confession up in Minnesota." "Well, I'm not asking, but you'll tell me, won't you? If I need to start keeping my shotgun behind the desk again?" Couldn't think of what to say. During those weeks when bodies were showing up in Nebraska, she must have been terrified. A woman alone, right off the highway. "Maybe I ought to just keep it out from now on," she said. I went back to my room, a room that I shared with, of course, Pilson. I kept expecting him to try to get at me about Marie or to change tactics and sweet-talk me again, but he barely said a word. In fact, I don't think our sharing a room was a part of his strategy at all. I just don't think anyone else would have me. In the end, though, I was sort of glad. I was nervous at night and couldn't sleep. Had I been in a room with any other person than Pilson, I might have spilled my guts just for someone to talk to. Instead, I lay on my side, facing the wall, and thought about the bodies lying dead somewhere nearby. Bodies that Marie had buried or helped to bury. Some time before dawn, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, Pilson was shaking me awake, saying it was time to get dressed and call Marie. The man in charge of the operation was with the FBI, Agent Daniel McCabe. He was a slender man of medium height and wore the same dark suit as the others, except that his necktie was oddly thin. He had dark hair, speckled, but not yet peppered with gray. He never smiled, and despite his diminutive size, it was obvious that he was in command. I've described him as slender, but really he was a twig. Skinny, but skinny in the mean, dangerous way, like a winter wolf. By the time we'd assembled in his room that morning to make the phone call, 12 agents and 3 cars of local police had joined us at the motel. They stood around drinking coffee from paper cups and watching me curiously. Pilson moved the phone from the bedside table onto the bed and pointed at me to say, "Is this normal?" I asked. This many men, and more to join us at the location. I had overheard a few of them speaking. For a body recovery? "We can't know for certain what we'll find," Agent McCabe replied, "or what we're being led into." "Nothing is my guess," said Pilson. He picked up the receiver and dialed the number back home. His jaw was tight, and after having shared a room with him and lying awake half the night, I knew that he hadn't slept much either. "What will you do after we find him?" I asked. "Long dead and just where she says he would be. Then who will you blame?" He glanced at me irritated. Then my dad must have picked up. "Sheriff Denton," Pilson said, "we're ready when you are. All right. Put her on." A pause. "Miss Muse?" Another pause and a grimace. "Miss Hale, I have Michael here as requested." He handed me the phone. "Hello, Michael," Marie said. "Hi, Marie." I looked at Agent McCabe, who gestured for me to hold the receiver away from my ears so that they could hear both sides. I did it, and he nodded. "We're in North Platte." "Where?" "The Sunshine Motel and Motor Lodge off the interstate." There was a pause. "Good," she said. "That's not far." "Where are we going, Miss Muse?" Pilson asked loudly and received a roomful of dirty looks. "Follow Highway 83 down to the lake," she said, and at a snap of Agent McCabe's fingers, 3 men fell over themselves trying to get him an unfolded map. "Take a right and follow the lake road until it turns off from the river, then go right again, heading north. After 3 miles, there will be an unmarked dirt road on your left. Take it. The house sits off in the middle of a field. There's a bright red mailbox and an oak tree in the side of the yard taller than the house." "Is there a house number on the mailbox?" Agent McCabe asked. "No." "What color is the house?" "Gray." "Where will we find the bodies?" "Have Michael put the phone back to his ear." McCabe frowned and backed off. He'd come so close listening that he could have puckered up and given me a kiss. He gave me another nod, and I placed the receiver back securely against my ear. "They still listening?" Marie asked. "They're still listening, but I don't think they can hear," I said. "I'm surprised they didn't try to hook us up to one of those tape recorders." "So am I." I'm going to tell you where the bodies are buried," she said. "So they'll have to bring you with." "They could just search the property themselves," I said, and she chuckled. "Don't give them any ideas." "But they won't. The property's too big." "All right, so where are they?" She paused. "Listen, Michael, I want to say that I'm sorry." "About what?" "About you having to see them. My mother and stepfather, I mean." "It's okay." I swallowed. I didn't know if it was. I'd never actually seen a dead body up close. "Can you do something for me?" "What's that?" I asked. "I need you to tell me if my stepfather's body is unmarked." "Unmarked?" "Uncut. Full of blood." "Sure," I said, and licked my lips nervously. "Sure, I will, but why?" because I made him swear to leave just that one alone. Will you make sure? Will you promise? I will, I promise. She sighed, heavy, and lowered her voice. The bodies are in the basement, near the west wall. It will work to bring them up. Will you call me when it's finished? I'll try, Marie. Okay, goodbye. We hung up, and I looked into the faces of a dozen waiting agents. I'll take you to them when we get to the house, I said. Pilson might have groaned. I knew he made a face. But Agent McCabe just asked, but the bodies are inside the house? When I nodded, a ripple of relief passed through the men. If they'd been buried elsewhere, the whole operation might have stalled until the spring thaw. Very good, he said. Let's get the warrant. Not an hour later, we loaded into the caravan of cars and police cruisers, and I did my best not to compare the precise practice movements of the agents to the slow and often haphazardous antics of Charlie and Bert. Still, I couldn't help but be impressed by the efficiency with which the agents moved. Agent McCabe coordinated with the local authorities in the span of 2 or 3 sentences, and within minutes we were pulling out of the motel parking lot as smoothly as floats in a parade. Pilson and I rode in the lead car with Agent McCabe and another agent whose name I didn't get. We sped down the highway and turned off at the lake, where the pace slowed as McCabe tried to follow Marie's directions. A few times we had to stop, and McCabe hung his arm out the window with a "what now" gesture, and an agent in the car behind us had to hang most of himself out to shout whether he thought this was the turn or that we hadn't gotten far enough. But once we reached the unmarked road, the house itself was easy to find. It stood in the middle of not just one field, but many, huge stretches of unplanted and untended land. Huge stretches of nothing, and besides the house, a bare winter oak. As we passed the red mailbox, I shivered and pretended like a draft of wind had snuck up my collar. But it wasn't that. It was the house, flat gray paint and white peeling trim, and obviously abandoned. And it looked to me like nothing but a grave. We parked in the area that should have been a driveway, though it was clear that no car had come through all winter. Our car floundered and spun tires a few times. We got out and stared up at the house. Our breath rose white in the still. It was cold, bitter cold, even without any wind, and as the men unloaded, thermoses of hot coffee came out with the picks and shovels. Agent McCabe looked around uneasily. Our party had descended upon the house like a cluster of flies, and we were out in the open. Our presence wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Well, Mr. Jensen, he said, where do we begin? Chapter 8, The Bodies. After you, Mr. Jensen, McCabe gestured to the porch, and I stepped up. I wasn't the first one in. 2 other agents had been inside already and done a sweep before emerging and calling, "Clear!" A small crowd of men followed Mr. McCabe and me into the house. Mr. Pilson stayed behind, looking cold and out of place, and I'm unashamed to say I did not feel sorry for him. The front door of the house opened directly into the main room. It had indeed been abandoned, and it had been abandoned with care. The sofa chair and large dining table had been covered over with sheets, by then largely coated with dust. And though the main furnishings were spare, the rest of the house was littered with possessions. Over the mantel was a long row of books, with more stacked along the wall. There were shelves and glass cases filled with all manner of things, figurines and ceramics, jeweled hat pins and jewelry boxes. One box held a fancy painted egg. The glass cases lined the entirety of the dining room and the far wall of the living room. One shelf was nothing but piles and piles of silver spoons, tiny and ornate, the kind that were never meant to be eaten off. The house felt oddly like a shrine, or maybe like storage. I couldn't help wondering whether Marie had ever been there, whether she had touched some of the strange objects, whether some of them were hers. "Send somebody outside down to the clerk's office," said McCabe. "See if they can find the owner of record." A few of the agents frowned. Not a man there thought the owner of record had been the last person in residence, or that they were still alive. We wandered the ground floor for a few minutes more, studying the items here and there, a typewriter resting against the wall of the hallway, a doll in a dress of blue silk. and I paused before a dark red door, nearly the same shade of red as the mailbox. "Tell us where to go, Mr. Jensen," said McCabe loudly, startling everyone. "And then if you like, you can go and wait in one of the cars, or an agent can take you back to the motel." "Aren't Mr. Pilson and I driving back tonight?" I asked. "Yes, but I think the federal government can afford to pay for another day's room." I hesitated. "Marie asked me to be there. She wants me to verify something about her stepfather's body." "What did she want you to verify?" "I'd rather not say, or I guess I'd rather tell you what it is when we find him." "Fair enough." He held out his hand again, like he had when he was motioning me to step into the house. So I walked past him to a second set of stairs that led to the basement. The door had already been opened by the agents who conducted the sweep. "They're down here." We walked down single file. The light from upstairs illuminated an 8 by 6 foot patch of plank wood flooring, which was lucky. I'd expect a lot of frozen dirt and agents toiling away with pickaxes. We stepped onto the floor, and our feet rang out against the hollowness. The corpses had been sealed up beneath the floorboards. "Near the west wall," I said. The agents commenced with the recovery at once, nearly trampling over me as they carried down tools and hung lamps from the low ceiling. In contrast with the crowded floor above, the basement was almost entirely empty, the walls an amalgamation of stone and dirt, supported by thick wooden beams. It did not run the full length of the house, only a 40 by 20 rectangle crudely shaped, and the only thing in it was a broken rocking chair, huddled like a ghost in the corner. With so many men in the small space, the air began to warm and gave rise to all of the smells that the cold had made dormant. I hung back near the stairs to stay out of the way, but also to keep from being too close when the first of the boards was pried up. The bodies would be frozen now, or nearly so, but the corpses would have been decaying in the basement all through the long, hot summer. I feared that they would have a scent, and that it would make me turn away, or get sick all over my shoes. "It's coming loose," one of the agents said. He'd been at the board with a pry bar and reached down to lever his fingers into the opening he'd made. The board came up with a dry creak. Every head in the room craned forward as he stepped back, one hand covering his mouth and nose, seemingly out of habit. There she was, Marie's mother. I couldn't see anything besides a flash of her dress, white cotton with a pattern of small brown flowers. But when I rose up on my toes, I saw that the removed board had revealed her lower half and her left leg. The skin of her calf was gray and withered, shrunken down to the foot that looked like it had never been filled, that looked like it could never have filled that dusty black shoe. The mood in the basement had been irritable at first. It changed immediately to one of practiced grimness. The agents had been through all this before. "Get the cameras," McCabe ordered. More boards came up. Within minutes, the whole of Marie's mother's corpse was exposed. Her hands had been folded on her chest, the fabric beneath stained dark from the black trickles of blood from cuts at her wrist. Her hair had been a deep brown like Marie's, and in death it had been laid out over her shoulders. I looked into her face to find traces of the girl I knew, but it had been altered too much by decay. "Not much blood," said the agent, leaning over the body. "Not even on the dress. But at least in this case, that was expected. We knew that Marie's mother had been killed somewhere else and brought here to be buried." Bursts from flash bulbs cut through the yellow light of the lamps. Then the photographer stepped back so the agents could resume tearing up the floor. I waited, tensing, as every new board was pulled away. Marie's stepfather would be there, right beside her. "Another body," an agent said. "It's not the stepfather." I broke through the barrier of agents and looked down. Marie's mother's body was tucked perfectly between two support beams. On the other side of her, where Nathaniel Cody should have been, was instead the corpse of an old woman. "Who is she?" McCabe asked me. It was supposed to be Nathaniel Cody. "Pull up more boards," Agent McCabe ordered. "Seems like a waste," said one of the men. "These are the only new boards. See here?" He held one up. "Different wood." He pointed at the exposed edges of the adjoining floorboards, which were noticeably different, warped and weathered. I kept on staring. The body beside Marie's mother looked like it had been dead longer. The skin was tighter, more wrinkled. I couldn't see any blood stains, but she was wearing black, kind of like Widow Thompson, who still wore only black after all these years. Pull them up anyway, McCabe said, and his voice was dull. Kid, why don't you give us some space? But if we can find anything else, we'll call you back down. You have my word. I looked back at the opened grave. More men came down with bags to transport the bodies out of the house. I went back upstairs feeling dazed. I'd been so certain that we would find him. Why had Marie sent me so far on a wild goose chase, I wondered. Why had she been so triumphant with Pilsen if she'd known she would only be proven a liar? I couldn't bear going outside and seeing Pilsen's smug face, so I wandered around the house, continually returning to the closed red door. It seemed odd that it would be closed, that the agents would shut it again after doing their sweep, but I figured there was no reason I shouldn't open it and go through. The red door was unlocked and came up, with a soft sound, barely a creak. I looked over my shoulder through the main room to the agents walking back and forth through the kitchen, but none seemed to notice. The agents in the basement were bound to be a while, and I'd be able to hear them if they called. Sound carried through the house like it was made of paper. So I walked down the hallway that had been blocked